Thank you, Congressman Neal. The business of whether I've been here 2 or 3 times or 4 times before is a bit of an embarrassment, my long-term memory not being what it used to be. Anyway, I know I've been here before on quite different issues. I wanted to talk about space in a broad context. I'm going to try to not spend a whole lot of time in formal, although slightly off-the-cuff remarks, because I'd love to have a real dialogue, as Congressman Neal said. Space covers a lot of ground. And when we talk about, you sometimes ask the question, are you for space or are you against it? That's too broad an issue. It has to be broken down into smaller pieces. And let me try to indicate some of the aspects of the space program that I think everyone agrees are cost-effective and should continue. And then let's get into some of the more difficult and controversial issues as well. Excuse me. Communication satellites link up the planet. Island nation like Indonesia with hundreds of separate islands, cost of laying submarine cable prohibitive. Now they all can talk to each other via geostationary satellite. Business and the stock market and governments are linked up. The planet is integrated. The economic consequences of communication satellites are enormous. And this is a consequence of the space program. Weather satellites save billions of dollars a year in the United States alone in advance warning about storms and cold spells that may endanger crops. Satellites that are involved with military reconnaissance and treaty verification are, as Lyndon Johnson once said, worth their weight in gold, because they calm the paranoids and hotheads on all sides. You don't have to assume the worst case. You can actually see what the potential adversary is planning, and you can make sure that arms control treaties are abided by. They're extremely important and should be encouraged. That's not NASA, obviously. That's on the National Reconnaissance Office, DOD, CIA end of things, but that is something well worth supporting. Satellites that monitor the environmental health of the Earth, NASA calls it Mission to Planet Earth, is just in its earliest stages. And without going into the question of the correct logistics, a few large and expensive satellites, many small and quick satellites, that question apart, this is really vital, because through depletion of the ozone layer, through global warming, through runoff of topsoil, and in many other ways, the environment that supports our species is in danger. And it's most important to know what's happening with a global perspective, and you can only get that from orbital altitudes. Then there are satellites, robot satellites, that look out, that, for example, examine the decaying fires from the Big Bang, the event that began the universe, or at least its most recent incarnation, about 15 billion years ago. The study of distant stars and galaxies, approaches that help us to answer questions about where this universe came from and where it's going, what its nature may be. Every human culture, one way or another, has tried to understand that. Here we are at the first time in history when we really have the means of finding out. I think you have to be made of wood not to be at least a little bit interested in it, and here comparatively inexpensive robotic spacecraft have made and are continuing to make enormous strides. Spacecraft that directly investigate through through flybys, orbiters, and landers, the other worlds in our solar system. An important outlet for exploration. We are an exploratory species, an important way of pumping fundamental science, and something very important for calibrating our planet by comparing it with others. Just to give a couple of examples, for those people who think that global warming is some hoax invented by liberal college professors, Venus is a very useful cautionary tale. Here is the nearest planet to the Earth, a planet in many respects most like the Earth, which has a surface temperature of 900 Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt tin or lead. And we know from spacecraft exploration that the reason for these hellish temperatures is the massive carbon dioxide and water vapor atmosphere on Venus. Now, I'm not suggesting that there was once a species of careless Venusians who insisted on driving fuel-inefficient automobiles. That's not my point. But if you doubt that massive quantities of carbon dioxide can produce an absolutely unlivable environment, just take a look at Venus. And likewise, with Viking, one of the things we were most surprised by was to find not only that there were no microbes on the surface, life might never have arisen on Mars, but that you couldn't even find any organic molecules, molecules built on carbon, when meteorites rich in organic molecules we know are falling on Mars and surviving. And the understanding is that this is caused, this is the general understanding of the planetary community, by the fact that Mars has what we might describe as a planet-wide ozone hole. That is, there's no ozone in the atmosphere. Searing ultraviolet light from the sun strikes the surface unimpeded, and directly and through its radiation products like peroxides, the ultraviolet light wipes out organic molecules. Isn't this something we ought to pay attention to, we who are busily depleting our own protective ozone layer? Other planets provide, I'll give you two examples, but there are many others, cautionary tales about what dumb things not to do with the Earth, and also about alternative fates of Earth-like worlds. And they are extremely important, it seems to me, although I confess a parochial professional interest in this end of what NASA does, and does so ably. Now we come to the most difficult issue, and that is manned and womaned spaceflight. I wish there was a better word. For a while I was toying with crewed, C-R-E-W-E-D, but that lent itself to all sorts of other misunderstandings. And so I'll try to say, human, but if I occasionally slip and say manned, I want to stress that I'm fully aware that there are many important astronauts who happen to be of the female persuasion. The Apollo program is the crux of manned human spaceflight, and absolutely cannot be understood except in the context of the Cold War. Apollo is a creature, was a creature of the Cold War. The nation that could orbit lots of human beings, the nation that could set down on a predetermined trajectory on a small spot on the moon, the nation that could send humans to the moon and bring them safely back to Earth, was a nation that had demonstrated its rocket potency. And that's important because it was rockets that carried strategic weapons halfway around the Earth. The United States and the Soviet Union were busy in a symbolic mutual intimidation with other nations, potential allies, potential defectors from allies, being the interested bystanders. And in this race, the United States, as all the world knows, won with Apollo 11. The deal that President Kennedy made with his science advisor, Jerome Wiesner, was that provided Kennedy didn't describe the Apollo mission as having anything to do with science, he, Wiesner, would support it. And with a couple of accidental slips, that was abided by. The clear demonstration that Apollo was nothing about science is the fact that the last astronaut to land on the moon was the first scientist to land on the moon. As soon as a scientist got there, it was clearly a waste of time. Well, not only did the United States win the race to put people on the moon, but the Cold War is over. The Soviet Union has collapsed. The competitive argument, whatever virtue it may once have had, Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin certainly scared the United States, whatever merit it may once have had has now gone. And we have to ask, what exactly is the function of human spaceflight? And because human spaceflight is so expensive, comparatively, this is, it seems to me, an essential topic which has to be debated. I don't want to suggest that I know what the answer is at the end of this debate, but it's a debate which has to be engaged in. And it seems to me the arguments like, well, we've always done it, or if we phase out some aspect of manned spaceflight, there'll be jobs lost. These are inadequate arguments. If we cannot justify it on its own merits, then there are many other crying national needs that are properly knocking at the door. Now, the mood of the country is very clear. In the middle 80s, I thought that a joint U.S.-Soviet human mission to Mars was a good idea for political reasons, to give these two adversaries that had accumulated between them some 55,000 nuclear weapons some common, long-term, high technology, worthy, far-seeing, inspiring goal. That seemed to me to be a real justification. And there was a little window when scientists seemed to have convinced the Soviet leadership. Mikhail Gorbachev proposed such a joint mission to the American leadership, but President Reagan turned him down flat. And now the moment has passed, and with the collapse of the Soviet Union, a substantial part, maybe not all, of the justification has passed. There is no question that human expedition to Mars would return enormously good science. But the case is certainly not made that you couldn't return as much or even more science with sophisticated robotic explorers if some amounts of money, more than what we are now spending on robotics, were authorized. There is a spin-off argument, which in the Apollo days went something like this: give us $25 billion to send people to the moon and we'll throw in a free stickless frying pan. But everybody understands, if stickless frying pans were high on the national agenda, that we could authorize some money directly aimed at stickless frying pans and don't have to go to the moon in order to accomplish it. And we could see in the fading days of Star Wars some similar desperate arguments when it was suggested that a hydrogen bomb-driven laser, X-ray laser battle station could be justified by the fact that it had applications to laser surgery. Well, maybe, but if laser surgery is what you're about, there are much cheaper ways that do not involve thermonuclear weapons to develop it. Spin-off arguments are a confession that the main thrust of the justification is gone and you're desperately looking for something else. If the justification of NASA is mainly spin-off, NASA is in deep trouble. It isn't, but it sometimes seems that way. There are educational aspects of human spaceflight. PhDs in the United States peaked with roughly the appropriate phase lag after the Apollo program was announced. And there's no question that people thought that was something inspiring and exciting and wanted to work in it, or at least something connected with it. But again, is it clear that this is the most effective way of spurring interest in science, considering how ineffective we are in the teaching of science, in the popularization of science, in the availability of laboratories and excellent textbooks and scholarships and fellowships and so on? How much weight does the argument based upon education actually carry? And there are some other arguments, some of them even less justifiable. There's an argument that we have to go to the moon massively in order to strip mine the moon, to harvest helium-3, to bring it back to Earth, to power the thermonuclear reactors. What thermonuclear reactors? We don't have any. We're unlikely to have them on any commercial scale for 50 years. And the global warming requires a solution to energy problems on a shorter time scale. And there's even the argument that world population growth requires human spaceflight, but there are 250,000 more people born than die every day on the Earth. And therefore, for spaceflight to make a dent in human population growth, you would have to launch 250,000 people every day, which is beyond the combined abilities of NASA and the other spacefaring nations for some considerable time into the future. If I look at this list of purported justifications, the question comes down to this: can the sum of a set of individually inadequate justifications amount to an adequate justification? If spin-off and science and education and a bunch of other things are none of them by themselves a justification, might all of them together be a justification? I don't know how to do that arcane calculus, but it seems to me that's the way the issue has to be phrased. Right now, NASA's focus on human spaceflight is shuttle and what used to be called the space station, but there are so many of them now, better to say a space station. What are their justifications? What is space station about? Former Vice President Quayle justified it in the following terms. He said the United States has to have a space station to demonstrate that it is the world's only superpower. This, like some other statements of former Vice President Quayle, is hard to follow, especially bearing in mind that the former Soviet Union has an operational space station that's about 10 years ahead of ours. How could it be the demonstration of superpower status, much less unique superpower status, for us to develop something that Russia already has? That's not a good justification. If we were convinced that we were going with humans to the planets on some time scale, like 20, 30 years or less, then of course it's essential to understand how humans behave in space over long periods of time, and then something like space station will make perfect sense. If that's not what we're going to do, if that's not an urgent national priority, and the debate has pretty much not been held, then I don't see what the justification is. What shuttle does, I mean, remember Challenger's job was to launch a communication satellite that could just as easily have been launched without any humans up there. We lost 7 brave Americans to do something that didn't involve any unique abilities of human beings. Almost all of what is done on shuttle, except for studying human behavior in space, could be done cheaply and more safely in the absence of humans. There is a new kind of solution to these questions, in which it is possible to save a lot of money and to do whatever it is we're going to do up there much quicker, and that is to utilize the space resources of other nations. It's a most interesting situation right now where no one nation can fully justify the very expensive missions involving humans in space, and where the capabilities of the various nations mesh beautifully. One of the most interesting meshes is between Russia and the United States, where Russia has the Mir space station, in which cosmonauts have stayed continuously for periods of up to a year, which is roughly the travel time one way to Mars. Russia has the Energia launch vehicle, a Saturn V class launch vehicle that can launch 100 tons to low Earth orbit. The United States has nothing approaching either of those two. The Russians are also desperate for hard currency. There is here a beautiful opportunity for the two nations to jointly do human spaceflight that neither nation could effectively justify doing alone. And there is some movement in this direction, but there's a lot of resentment and resistance in the NASA, DoD, and other bureaucracies, and in the aerospace industry. The President directed, and the NASA administrator passed on the recommendation that a Russian team be involved in the redesign being undergone right now of the U.S. space station. They came over, were given offices across the river in Crystal City, and a few weeks later left in a huff. They couldn't even get a straight answer as to what was expected of them. United States policy was in disarray on this issue, as it has been for the last many years. The overall trend, though, is clear. U.S. astronauts are now planned to have a mission to Mir. Soviet cosmonauts are planned to go up on shuttle. There's a U.S. scientific instrument on the Soviet Mars 94 lander. There were Soviet planetary geologists on the Magellan mission to Venus. We're beginning to work together. But the major kind of working together, the use of the great strengths of Russia with the great strengths of the United States, that isn't being done. And it's partly because if we buy their boosters, then some aerospace company will, they imagine, lose sales of their boosters, except nobody has a Saturn V class booster, so the argument is somewhat specious. If Russia and the United States, the European Space Agency, and Japan, maybe a few other nations, but those four principal spacefaring nations, were to get together, then the capability would go way up. The cost would, after a getting to know each other time, go way down, and then I think it might be possible to justify. I'm worried that we don't have a ghost of a chance of sending people to near-Earth asteroids or the Moon or Mars in the next few decades if we imagine that the United States is going to do it all by itself. For me, there is a final kind of justification for spaceflight, and that is less tangible than the sort of things I was talking about. That involves things like understanding from space the perspective of the human species. It's a kind of meadow in the sky in a universe that is very inhospitable. It teaches us a respect for our own planet. There is something in a lot of people, not in everybody, a kind of exploratory zest and the Earth is all explored. There is a need to give a kind of vision of a hopeful future to young people who are given the most dismal impression of the future by what's in the media and by the ineffectiveness of the political life. Going into space provides a, I think, potentially extremely important vision of a hopeful future, and that's worth something also. So I would hope that those of you who have votes on these issues would, of course, make sure that real justification is given for proposed expenditures, especially very large expenditures, but that you will also bear in mind that there is a large part of the National Space Program which is clearly, with a huge margin, cost-effective, and that there are intangible factors that may be difficult to quantify, but that might be nevertheless extremely important. Thanks for your attention, and I'd be glad to take questions on this or anything else on your mind. I understand there's a mobile mic. Here it comes. Anybody? Yes, right here, please.
Sagan.
Could I ask you to identify yourself?
Sure, I'm
please?
Connie Morella, and I serve on the House Committee on Science, Space, Technology.
Thank you.
From Montgomery County, Maryland. But I'm curious to get your response to the space station as it is being watered down. Phase 1, 2, 3. Are we going to be able to come up with something that is going to be worthwhile? Should we be working more with the Russians and the European, we already are supposedly with the European community. Do you see that we're going to be able to come up with a product or a goal that's going to be worthwhile for the expenditure with the watered down versions that we're seeing?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Well, this is NASA work in progress. I mean, right now NASA has a large design team which is busily, in response to a directive from Congress, redesigning. And what will come out of it, nobody knows. But it seems to me that a redesign, you say watering down, which is, I mean, it'll spend less money, but maybe it won't do things that shouldn't have been done in the first place. But to do it without major participation by Russia seems to me an extremely serious mistake. It's true that Japan and the Europeans and Canada are partners, but they're partners in a very subsidiary sense. That is, the United States calls the shots and they build their own modules and attach them. We get access to their modules, they don't get access to our modules. That has been the U.S. approach to international cooperation on such issues. And what the other spacefaring nations have long been asking, and what I think is now essential, is that the design of these should be an equal partnership in which everybody has something to say about the long-term goals and objectives and the means of carrying it out. I can't predict what the consequences, what the results will be of the redesign effort, but it's certainly not impossible that something simpler and cheaper can nevertheless accomplish all the goals that are legitimate for space station. And I would say that a whole lot of the supposed scientific studies that don't involve human physiology can be done elsewhere without people. It's the human physiology end of things which is what space station ought to be exclusively or almost exclusively directed towards, in my opinion.
Before we take another question, let me say to the congressmen and women that are here, we've had the second bells for a live quorum to be followed by a vote. And we'll have to run over and respond to that in just a minute. I want to leave Rob Wrigley, my administrative assistant, who I know is here. Rob, where are you? Right, I'll leave you sort of to close things down in case we don't get back in time. But since we may not get back before you have to leave, I want to thank you on behalf of everyone here for coming, and we will try to come back and be with you some more. But thank you, sir, very much.
Thank you, Congressman Neal. I'm in favor of the. I'm in favor of the nation's business being done, so please don't worry about me. Yes.
Sherry
Microphone
Bowler,
right behind you.
I represent New York's 23rd District, and I'm a senior member of the Science Committee. One of the great difficulties we have in Congress, being generalists, is trying to prioritize our scientific expenditures. 3 years ago, the Industrial Research Institute was asked of its members in the private sector to prioritize 5 big science megabuck projects. And they came out with the following rankings. Human genome was 1, national aerospace was 2, space station was 3, SDI was 4, and the superconducting supercollider was dead last 5. If you were asked to prioritize those 5 big science megabuck projects, how would you prioritize them?
Well, first thing I would say is that 3 of them aren't science at all. They use science, but they're not about science. Strategic Defense Initiative, which is just now collapsed, doesn't exist anymore, right? It's now the Ballistic Missile Defense Initiative, and it doesn't even report directly to the Secretary of Defense. It's come down in the world. That's not science. That is the application of science, that is technology, to defense purposes. To lump that in the same ballpark as the Human Genome Project, I simply don't understand at all. Human Genome Project and the Superconducting Supercollider are the only 2 scientific items on that list. By the way, hi Sherry, good to see you. We're neighbors. If I wanted to get prioritized, I'd put a lot of other things on that list. I'd put the B-2 on that list. I'd put the Seawolf attack submarine that the Department of Defense says it doesn't need, but Congress insists that it does need for reasons of jobs on that list. I would put a large number of weapon systems, some of which have problems about whether they are being produced according to specifications or on time or on budget, and some of which are simply unnecessary. The B-2, whatever its alleged function in nuclear war, that is to the authoritative justification of the B-2 by the Air Force Chief of Staff a few years ago was that its function was to destroy the Soviet mobile ballistic missiles that had not already been destroyed by sea-launched and ballistic missiles and ICBMs. That's a completely different world. We don't live in that world anymore. And it has no function. And yes, it's spiffy to have a subsonic bomber that is more difficult to see on radar, but considering the cost, whatever it is, tens to hundreds of billions of dollars, let's strike that. And likewise, there are a large number of other items on the Department of Defense wish list that are not needed after the collapse of Russia, that are a drain in a nation that has an extremely long list of urgent needs. I mean, I'm thinking of collapsing infrastructure, highways, bridges, sewers, aqueducts. I'm thinking of the fact the United States is 23rd in the world in infant mortality among the industrialized nations. There are 22 other nations that save the lives of their babies better than we do. I'm thinking about local and global environmental issues. I'm thinking about what our rotten education in science and lots of other things so many American children get. I'm thinking about homelessness and AIDS, and a list as long as my arm. They all take money to solve. They are essential for national security. Why national security should be considered poured into the tiny and parochial vessel of weaponry when so much else should be included, I can't understand. If we persist in this direction, there won't be very much left to defend. So I think it is perfectly legitimate to require of any scientist or of NASA or anybody else to justify in terms of national needs their requests for funding, especially in the multi-billion-dollar range. But that precise exercise ought to be required of those who are requesting that amount of money or more for weapon systems. And the argument that General Dynamics Electric Boat Company workers will be laid off in Connecticut and therefore we have to build things we don't need is not a good argument. Let's spend some of the money saved on job retraining, and if collapsing infrastructure is a problem, let's put those workers, let's put the workers in the weapons laboratories, national weapons laboratories, to work on solving these kinds of problems. So a lot of technological problems which need to be solved that are essential for the civilian economy. So I know this is a much broader answer than the question asked for, but I guess I discover I had it on my chest. I hope in the course of it I actually did address the question you asked, Jerry. Thanks so much. Yes.
Dr. Sagan, are there any...
Could you identify yourself, please?
Pardon?
Could you identify yourself?
Yes. Jim Scheuer, former member of this glorious body.
And an old friend.
In which I spent 26 extremely happy years. Can you, and served on the Science-Based Technology Committee for many years, can you suggest some pure, you didn't think much of that list of 5 science projects, mega projects that you heard. Only 2 of them you considered science projects at all. Can you give us some other tidbits? Can you whet our appetite for significant science projects, maybe that don't come in the mega science category, maybe smaller projects that still have great potential for contributing to human well-being?
Jim, I would say that the very fact of asking, as the people Sherry was talking about did, for a list of extremely expensive projects to do in, quote, science, misses an essential point. And that is that a great deal, the most important science, comes in ways that no one ever could predict. Comes from supporting small projects, graduate students, independent research, people who don't have any practical application in mind, but just one thing leads to another. So all through the sciences today, there are problems in which established scientific investigators can't get the money just to keep doing what they've been doing, in which young scientists, recent graduate students, done extremely well, gotten their PhDs, now they need some money to pursue their science. The money isn't available. It's young people, you're on your own. We don't have enough money. And as more money gets poured into specific projects, and as the National Science Foundation is directed to spend more money on particular programs that reflect the national need, there gets less and less available for fundamental research, and it's a very dangerous trend. These should not be alternatives. We should, if we're interested in the well-being of the country, and science and engineering are important aspects of it, then it's essential to support the research of young scientists. Let me try to give just a flavor of why this is important. Look, here we have a public address system. There's a television camera. Here are incandescent lights. Give us a sense of the technology all around us. The food was refrigerated before it came here. Now, where did all that electrical technology come from? Suppose you were Queen Victoria's science advisor, Jim. And this is bizarre on many levels, but imagine she came to you and said, this one, Queen Victoria's science advisor, is not available. Suppose she came to you and said, you know, what I would like is a kind of box in which there could be a moving picture that I would be sitting at Balmoral Castle and somehow the picture of me would be in a box in the home of every British citizen, and that would help run the empire, or whatever she would say. I mean, suppose such a bizarre request were put to you in 1850. What could you do about this? Could you have a crash program, a Manhattan Project to develop television? No way. It just, the science was not available. But meanwhile, in that same rough period of time, there's a Scottish physicist named James Clerk Maxwell. And what he's doing is looking at experiments on electricity and magnetism done mainly by French scientists. And he tries to write down equations to sum up their results. And there's 4 equations, and he looks at them, and they are aesthetically displeasing. They don't have symmetry, and he thinks they ought to. So for aesthetic reasons only, physicists call this intuition, he added another term to make it all look nice. That additional term is called the displacement current. With that in, you discover that moving electrical charges can generate light waves, and from Maxwell's equations comes much of modern technology. Now, Maxwell did not intend to do anything having to do with the technology. He was interested in how electricity and magnetism works, and just one thing led to another. Now, that's not a justification for any scientist who requests money to do anything. You know, there's good science and bad science, and you have to make decisions, but it's important to remember that the most vital findings often come from somebody you never expected, from some line of work that seemed to have no applications at all. Moving electrical charges, who would have figured that it would come out of that? And that's why I would urge organizations that spend money on science, National Science Foundation, NASA, and others, to remember that it is absolutely essential to support many small projects, especially for young scientists. Any other questions? I'd be happy to take them from people who aren't members of Congress. Yes, one here?
I think that's correct on the series Cosmos, suggested that we might use nuclear powered spacecraft to explore the other, the rest of the universe. How do you feel about that today? Is it correct? Is it?
I'll tell you in a minute. In Cosmos, I talked about a proposal which was called Project Orion, which came out of, in fact, the U.S. weapons laboratories, which was to use nuclear weapons to propel against a kind of pusher plate, putt, 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 each nuclear explosion being a putt, a spacecraft, large spacecraft at eventually high speed to the outer solar system and beyond. And I gave that as one of many examples of the kinds of technology which are then being thought of. But I stated there that there were certain undesirable side effects of this means of propulsion. The good one was you'd be destroying a lot of nuclear weapons in the process, but the bad one was you'd be contaminating nearby space with radiation, and you would not want to launch too near the Earth, and so on. In any case, this is not a feasible present technology for this purpose, and nuclear weapons are being dismantled in a more direct way, both tactical and strategic weapons in the United States, and I hope in Russia. Other questions? If not, oh, there's one. Could you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, Paul Alexander with Congressman Sangmeister of Illinois. I mean, you spoke about the crewed mission to Mars. Do you still support that? I mean, you supported it in the 80s. Do you still feel that we should do that?
My view is something like this. In the Bush administration, President Bush strongly supported human mission to Mars. It was called SEI, Space Exploration Initiative. The kind of numbers that we heard about were hundreds of billions of dollars to send one mission of humans to Mars. and something like a 30-year timescale. Now, that was widely recognized as politically undoable, never mind technological or other issues. Now, you might argue that $300, $400, $500 billion isn't all that much money. It's the amount stolen in the savings and loan scandal, and nobody seemed to mind that very much. So why not use it here? It would certainly be a better use of it than the theft of money by rich bankers. But that's not the way it works. It turns out that $300 billion from Mars is unacceptable. $300 billion stolen in the savings and loan scandal is slap on the wrist. No members of the government, as far as I know, have ever been jailed for that. It's too expensive. I know I'm rambling. In addition, it's too far in the future. Why should considerable political capital be spent now so that 30 years from now, some other president, who knows, of a different political party even, might reap the benefits? If it were possible to have a human mission to Mars on a timescale of 10 or 15 years and a cost of under $100 billion, which would fit well within the present spending envelopes of NASA and the other spacefaring nations, then it's a completely different story. Then it is achievable, the timescale is practical, people can work on it during a reasonable lifetime, and such a mission I would strongly support. There are some recent studies suggesting that there might be ways of doing that. One aspect of which is you use the Russian Energia booster. Another is you you provide your propellants for your return mission to Earth from Martian materials. You don't have to carry it to Mars. So under those circumstances, I think I would support it. But the longer time scale, savings and loan scandal level of expenditure missions, I would not. Yes?
Saunders with Space News. It's a little bit of a follow-up to...
I'm sorry, you're with?
Space News.
Yes.
A little bit of a follow-up to that. You had said earlier, though, that before human spaceflight should be considered, the function has to be identified.
Yes.
What would be your argument for the, even though it would be economically feasible, for that human presence on Mars?
Yes. You remember before I was asking, could the sum of a set of individually inadequate justifications add up to an adequate one? And clearly, the cheaper the overall cost, the more likely it is that the answer to that question is yes. My seat-of-the-pants judgment, and you know, if you asked me to justify it in a way that would convince everybody, I don't know that I could. But my seat-of-the-pants judgment is that if it comes in under $100 billion, and it can be done in 10 or 15 billion years, the benefits become highly cost-effective. And by that I mean the science, even though you could do great stuff with robots, the inspirational value for young people and others, education, technological spin-off, national pride, cooperation with other nations, and the building of bonds between industrial nations. All of that put together, it seems to me, would be worth it under those circumstances.
Same argument to space station, though, that as the cost is decreased, that those particular benefits that people are arguing for would become better arguments?
I have more trouble with it for space station, although I'd be happy to consider it for space station, because space station is not exploratory. It doesn't do any science, certainly not any fundamental science. It doesn't have the same virtues that going to Mars goes. But of course, if we were going to go to Mars, then you would have to be sure that we could do it safely, and the way to find out what it takes to do it safely would have to be something like space station. So it's a question of order, but if we made a national decision, if some president decided that this were something historic that he or she wanted to do, then I think the role of space station would fall neatly into place. The trouble is that we are trying to justify space station before we have any commitment to sending humans to the planets, and so it always seems to be incommensurate with the objectives. You know, we always heard of shuttle as the next step, but we never heard what it was the next step to. And then we heard of space station as the next step, and we never heard what it was the next step to either. In Wernher von Braun's vision, he knew the answer to those questions. Shuttle was the step to space station, and space station was the step to Mars. But this was considered politically infeasible to speak its name out loud, and so we always had these truncated assessments. It's the next step, don't ask to where. And I think that that issue of what is the function of space station is very much in the minds of members of Congress, and is very much part of the reason why there is so much skepticism about it. Some of which it seems to me is perfectly justified, and some of which seems to me a little bit unfair. Yes, please. Could you identify yourself? I'm sorry.
Tom Adams, I'm with the National Weather Service. It seems to me that one of the basic problems, I mean, and you've essentially stated it yourself, is that in justifying science, including the space shuttle or manned spaceflight, part of the problem is justifying it in philosophical grounds. And in many ways, that's the only way we can justify any of this. If you look at this calculus of economics in terms of trying to justify it in a cost-benefit sort of approach, you always fall short. And so a lot of it does come down to the need to reach out to the universe. And it is intangible. And so I'm wondering if you would agree with that to some degree.
This is fundamentally a religious argument. And not everybody shares that particular faith. And so if Mars called to you from childhood, and if you always wanted to visit there, and if you always imagined that human spaceflight was the obvious culmination of the human exploratory instinct, that of course we would go there, then all of this debate seems foolish and besides the point, and you know, let's get on with it. But not only does not everybody share that view, I think most people do not share that view. And if you had children who didn't have enough to eat, the idea of spending $100 billion, much less $300 or $500 billion to send some people to Mars would seem ludicrous. And that's what I'm talking about. There is a real point against. What's the hurry? They might very well ask us. Mars has been there 4.5 billion years. So it'll be there another 30 years, 50 years, 100 years. Okay, for me, the romantic me, the kid who always wanted to go to Mars, you know, age 7, 30, 50, 100 years from now doesn't answer my needs. I won't be around then, very likely. So I have a personal vested interest, but that should not cloud my judgment, because we're talking about national policy, and for national policy, the religious urge to go explore the planets just doesn't carry much water, it seems to me. Well,
are there no other questions? Well, if that concludes our discussion today, and Dr. Sagan, thank you on behalf of the Congressional Clearinghouse on the Future.
Thank you.
For your time.
And thanks for some very provocative and interesting questions. I enjoyed it.